Welcome to our session, Anti-Asian Racism as a Humanist Issue, presented by Mary Zhang of the Secular Student Alliance.
So again, like Nicole said, my name is Mary Zhang. I'm very happy to be here with all of you to present on my topic, which is anti-Asian racism as a humanist issue. As probably you can imagine, some content warning will be discussing racism, xenophobia, sexism, religious oppression, things that some people might find upsetting. I will be talking about my personal anecdotes and my personal experiences. So use discretion, step away, take your time as needed. First, I wanted to start my presentation off with a land acknowledgement. Some of you may know what that is, some of you may not, but essentially it's just a way to acknowledge the land that we are situated on in North America. So Tallahassee, where I'm currently located, is on land that is ancestral and traditional territory of the Appalachian Nation, the Muskogee Nation, the Miskogee Nation of Florida, and the Seminole Tribe of Florida. McGill University, where I am currently obtaining a university degree and is situated in most of the year, is a traditional territory of the Kanakahagan, a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among many Indigenous and First Nations, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe Nations. If you're interested in finding out where your land, what your land's history is, you can check out the nativeland.ca, which is a great source that encompasses all of North America. If you're not very familiar with decolonization discourse or Indigenous land acknowledgement discourse, just quickly search up decolonization, indigenization. If these aren't topics that you're familiar with, it's a really great place to get started and become more knowledgeable. I'm spending a bit more time on this topic because it is very close to my heart and it's something I think is very important. Both the US and Canada are settler colonial nations, and as settlers of Turtle Island, which is what the Indigenous peoples called North America, regardless of our immigration status and background, we must recognize that we hold privilege in the past and in the present over the people that are Indigenous to the land. And colonialism, racism, and other systemic structures of oppression are deeply interconnected and interdependent. And we can't tackle anyone without addressing the rest as well. And this is something that will hopefully come through for the rest of my presentation as well. And although land acknowledgements are very common in Canada, where I normally am, actually American Humanists are the first people that are US based that asked me to give a land acknowledgement. So that's good on them. I just wanted to give them a little shout out for being on the right path, even though we still have a very long way to go. Okay, moving into my actual presentation. So my name is Mary Zhang and I'm Asian. So I guess that makes me qualified. Just kidding, not really. So I'm a first generation Chinese American. I'm an atheist that grew up in the American Deep South. And I'm currently studying for a Bachelor of Commerce at McGill University. And I have an academic background in sociology and academic research, which gives me the vocabulary and research methods and the ability to speak, I guess, more structurally and more comprehensively about these issues, which puts me in a position of privilege, and I'm very privileged to be able to do that and hopefully represent my community well. So let's jump right in. In the past year, we have had 3,800 anti-Asian racism incidents. Most of them were against women, as you can tell. Women were twice likely to report anti-Asian racism incidents. The attacks on Asian Americans spiked by 164% in the first quarter of 2021, and by 223% in New York City alone. These are really scary statistics for me to say as an Asian woman myself. I'm sure most people remember this incident right here. This is just a clip from a news website, but the Atlanta spa shooting or massage parlor shooting, however you want to call it, which happened earlier this year, back in March. So, but based on these news headlines and statistics, it might be easy for people to say, you know, anti-Asian racism in America originated from the coronavirus and is an unprecedented and shocking crisis. Nobody saw this coming, right? Or is it? So let's go into the history of it a bit, which I guess for the non-history buffs, I will try to keep it entertaining. But essentially, the history of anti-Asian racism could be traced back to the 19th century as a good place to start. So back then, there was this movement called Orientalism, which is a sub-movement of the larger Rococo and Romantic movement of Europe. And of course, the US being a settler colonial situation of Europe was deeply influenced by it as well. They described the Orient, which was originally referring to Turkey, Greece, Middle East, and North Africa, which then later expanded to include East Asia as well, as exotic, mysterious, alluring, but backwards and barbaric, and a scary place. It was used directly or indirectly to justify European and Christian imperialism. It made it so that it was painting the picture of European Christians coming around and civilizing and colonizing the barbaric Orientals, and it was a thing that was good for people in the East. So overall, it was this image of the East as being sexy, but being scary. So this is something that you'll see over and over and over being perpetuated in history in different forms, and I'll point them out as we go. But here you can see some images that I put, some artistic images I put of, depictions of Eastern harems, depictions of Eastern markets, and here a white woman dressed up in a Japanese costume, in a Japanese outfit, in what is now considered the art movement of Japanism, I think that's how you say it. But yeah, so which is a subsection, which is a sub-movement of Orientalism as well, specifically focusing, as you can imagine, Japan. So next chapter, around the same time, by mid-19th century, we get it coinciding with the first wave of Chinese immigration into the US, and of course, the Yellow Peril, which some of you may have already heard of. Chinese laborers escaping from the Opium War are rushing into North America as part of the gold rush into California and railroad building. They were called coolies, which was a derogatory term for cheap labor. So this was when yellow peril really came around. So the scapegoating of blaming Asian Americans, Chinese Americans who were immigrating for the loss of jobs and the loss of opportunities that the white settlers felt like they weren't receiving, even though it was just there weren't that many opportunities to go around, but they blamed it on the Chinese. So the Page Act of 1875 banned male coolies and female prostitutes, which is interesting the way the words were chosen, because that was really how all Chinese immigrants were characterized. It didn't matter if you were if you're a woman, it didn't matter if you're actually a prostitute. They characterized you as a prostitute. If you're a man, you were automatically cheap labor. That's how you were automatically categorized. And then the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and then later, of course, the Japanese and Middle Easterners, Oceanians received similar treatments with the Gentleman's Agreement and the Immigration Act of 1917, essentially being banned from immigrating to the United States. Here's some examples of yellow peril in the media to help you contextualize. So here's Fu Manchu, probably the most famous Asian character, sadly. Some people call him the yellow peril incarnate. He's this cruel and cunning villain that's very manipulative and very evil. And then here we have Shisui Hayakawa, who is a silent era film star in Hollywood, and he is actually Japanese American. And as you can tell, he's quite a good looking and dashing young man, and he played a lot of roles of the forbidden lover. But white people in Hollywood, white men, were so threatened by his sexual appeal as a sex symbol for white women that eventually he was typecasted to play basically only villain roles to reduce his influence. By mid-19th century, we're still in the mid-19th century, we had the Chinese Massacre of 1891 in Los Angeles, which was the single worst lynching in US history. At least 17 Chinese people were lynched after a conflict with the police, and the white perpetrators were not prosecuted. This is a part of history that, shockingly, a lot of people don't know. And then similarly, we had the Rock Spring Massacre in 1885 as well. So you see this pattern of very violent persecution against Chinese Americans as a result of the yellow peril propaganda and narrative. And then in the 1940s, of course, we had World War II, which in the US characterized the Japanese internment camps after Japan entered World War II by bombing the Pearl Harbor of the United States. The US government forced tens of thousands of Japanese Americans into internment camps solely based on ethnic background. These were people that, had little to no relation to Japan because they've lived in the US for perhaps generations, and they were American citizens by all means. And this is the time that you see xenophobia, which is a fear of foreigners. And Asian Americans were perpetually seen as foreigners, even if they've been in the United States for generations or years and are by all means citizens. And of course, Chinese Americans took to extreme measures to distance themselves from the Japanese. So you see a huge schism within the Asian American community, which is worth noting. It didn't really exist. Individual communities existed, but there wasn't really a pan-Asian American solidarity at that time. And during the Cold War, after the World War II ended, we see a rise of white Christian nationalism, which I think will be of interest to most of us here, since we're humanists and we seem interested in, we're probably interested, well, not interested in, but interested in fighting against white Christian nationalism, I would hope. So Christian nationalism is the idea that American nation is defined by Christianity and that the government should actively work to keep it that way. Here's a quote that I found that I thought was really great while researching. So American propaganda casts Cold War as one of history's greatest religious wars between the godless and the God-fearing, between the good and the evil. So this is when we really connected being Asian to being atheist and to being communist and to being evil. And this was sort of this moral streamline. So it's the good Christian white Americans against the evil atheist Easterners. And if you can see here, here's an image, a political cartoon. If you notice earlier in the yellow peril slide, we also had an octopus, but it was yellow. This time around, I guess it will be red, even though it's not colorized. I don't know why octopus seems to be a common popular imagery, but here's a Chinese red octopus standing over China and reaching across to America. And you see this little innocent looking all-American white family standing there, just trying to defend their homeland. Or their homeland as they see it. So that's very interesting. Now you may think, okay, so this was World War II, a while ago. What does this have to do with anti-Asian racism today? The form of discrimination and the rhetoric used has persevered way past. Christian nationalism has persevered way past, the deadline of the Cold War, as we probably all know sitting here. For me personally, when I was attending middle school in the America Deep South in a rural town in Florida, the most common questions that I probably got in relation to my ethnicity, my race, my identity was, number one, do you eat dogs? And number two, are you an atheist because you're a communist? So these things that may seem distant to us are still very real and very alive in our societies and in our communities. And you can imagine that was hell of a question for a 12-year-old to answer. So yeah, just to contextualize that it's still very much alive today. And during the Cold War and the aftermath, of course, as we know, we had the proxy wars, which prominently the US got involved in Vietnam and Korea. And as a result of that, there were tons of war orphans and war brides and refugees that were fleeing the war that were being imported to America. And this is when we see a sort of renaissance of the imagery of Asian women as sex workers and the sexualization and fetishization of Asian women. And you start seeing what we now call yellow fever. So the lotus flower China doll stereotype of this innocent childlike woman that's sexually submissive and docile and in need of a white man saving her. As you can see here, I've put a poster of a musical called Miss Saigon, which is exactly about that, a white Marine saving this Vietnamese prostitute. And this is, as some of you who may be music buffs like me know, this is inspired by an older opera called Madame Butterfly, which is the same exact story, but set in World War II Japan. So this is nothing new. This is just being rehashed, right? In the United States, we had the Vietnamese shrimpers in Texas that were attacked by the KKK, who shrimpers were people that were shrimp fishers, essentially. And again, that's perpetuating narrative of the Asians stealing white jobs, and that's why they felt threatened by those shrimpers, and that's why the KKK organized to attack them. So these patterns of hate are not new, is I guess the lesson of my little history lesson in the end. So then, we see these imageries of even disease racism, pandemic racism, right? Calling it the Asian flu, SARS, bad Chinese takeout. And today we see the same thing. The Kung flu, the China virus, the eating bats. You see the same narrative. It's not new. Oop. And these patterns of hate can be extrapolated to other ethnic groups as well, other communities as well. Not to say that they started with Asian Americans or they started with these other groups and extrapolated the other way around, but these patterns are consistent. These patterns are being used over and over again by white supremacy to justify their actions. They're preying on our women. This is Emmett Till. This is against Black, specifically Black men communities. They're stealing our jobs, justifying the treatment of Mexicans at the border. They're unchristian and civilized, the way we look at and we treat Muslim Americans and other people of different religious groups in America. So going back again to this lovely webpage of the massacre. So when it first happened, I was still in Canada, but I was getting ready to come back to the US for the end of my academic year. So at that point, by the time I got back to Florida, it was about 2 weeks or so after this incident. So people were still talking about it. It was very hot on people's tongues. So one of the things that someone I knew said to me was, it's so horrific and it makes no sense. Why would they kill Asians? Asians are the most harmless people. They do nothing wrong and they hurt no one. Which obviously this lovely gentleman meant well in the way that he said it. He obviously meant it to denounce the actions of the killer and to express, I guess, solidarity in some way. Although that line definitely did not sit well with me. And hopefully you guys can imagine why. But this kind of, I think, is a great segue to lead into talking about the model minority myth, which is you probably can't have a discussion around anti-Asian racism or Asian issues in America without talking about the model minority myth. Although, this isn't the focus of my presentation, but I'm going to briefly touch on it because if I went in depth, then this is going to be a 30-minute presentation in of itself, and we just don't have time for that, unfortunately. So in terms of the model minority myth, it was really begun in the World War II as a strategic rebranding of Chinese Americans. Chinese Americans were lauded for their cultural values, and that was seen as a solution to social ills. They were lauded as a prime example of the melting pot assimilation and positioned against Black urban ghettos that were, I guess, kept more to themselves, as white supremacists saw them. The term model minority was coined in the 60s as the stereotyping and valorization of Asian ethnicities in the US. It originally focused on East Asians, the Japanese, and the Chinese, and it delegitimizes struggles and distinctions within the Asian American community. For example, when you paint us all over with this lovely, rose-colored glasses, wide stroke brush, then we ignore South Asians and Southeast Asians and other darker skinned Asians who have different experiences and different struggles, and they get excluded from the conversation. This is why we see stuff like, Indian Americans or South Asian Americans being told, oh, you aren't really Asian, even though they totally are Asian. It's because we have this idea of the model minority and what that's supposed to look like. Especially South and Southeast Asians were largely benefited by the affirmative actions that universities took on. Well, East Asians were eventually became opposed to it because they saw it as discriminatory against them. That's because they didn't really see South Asians and Southeast Asians as part of the movement, as part of the community. And largely, this is probably the most crucial part. The model minority myth was leveraged to challenge and delegitimize Black civil rights activism. And here's a quote that I found that I think contextualizes it. This was from the US News and World Report. So at a time when it was proposed that hundreds and billions be spent to uplift Black and other minorities, one such minority, the nation's 300,000 Chinese Americans, is winning wealth and respect by dint of its own hard work, not a welfare check. So I think this contextualizes it pretty clearly, this is a white supremacist narrative of saying, instead of complaining about and advocating for change and, asking for reparations, why don't you just look at the Chinese Americans? They're doing just fine. Why don't you just work hard and play hard and you'll be just fine. So if you stop complaining, everything will be just fine. Which was mainly leveraged to use against Black and brown activists. So now what? I think in terms of advice on allyship, here's what I can give you. First off, allyship is a verb. We must continuously listen and learn and evolve. It's not something that you can just say, I'm an ally to Asian Americans. trust me, that doesn't help. Actually, another personal anecdote, when about 2 weeks after the shooting happened, so when I first got back to Florida after my academic year, someone that was in my social circle that I knew for sure had called me a very racist and very sexist slur just weeks before, had decided to post a little Instagram infographic about how he is an ally to Black, Asian, and all people of color. And I was, and you can imagine how that felt to me. So allyship is not, it's not a label you can slap on yourself. It's a verb, it's a continuous action. So here are some tips that I guess I can give you. One is to continuously learn, listen, and contextualize and unlearn. Hopefully, some of the history that I introduced here today helps you contextualize, some of the rhetorics and narratives and terms and stereotypes and why they're harmful. And by learning the history of them and the overall overarching paradigms, that's how you can really start to unlearn. Our Western society and Western education is very focused on learning, obtaining new knowledge. However, sometimes most of us are educated in institutions that were put in place by white supremacy. And as well-intentioned as our teachers have been, they carry some of that. And our textbooks, our curriculums carry that. It's important to unlearn. It's important to unload that. Also, understanding perspectives of Asians living in their homeland differ from that of the Asian diaspora, and neither is more valid than the other. That's something that I had to learn myself as someone that's, I've lived both as a Chinese American in America and as a Chinese person in China. I've spent so far my life about evenly between the two, which is not the case for most Asian Americans or Asian people in Asia. So obviously they have very diverging narrative. They have very different life experiences. I see this a lot in appropriation, in cultural appropriation discourse, where people will say, oh, but my friend who is actually from China, my friend who is in China told me I can wear this. My friend in Vietnam told me I can wear this. Keep in mind, their perspective and their experiences of their culture differs from that of the diaspora, of people who are no longer living in the homeland, who live somewhere else, who is a citizen or a resident of somewhere else. And finally, be intersectional. And I think just to sum everything up, here's a really great quote, mostly addressing intersectionality that I found during my research by a professor of the University of Connecticut. So he said, an Asian American ethics of care is not simply for Asian Americans, but one derived from the experiences of Asians and Asian Americans during these crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. This ethics of care is a shorthand for the resources, methods, and strategies of feminism, anti-war, anti-racism, and decolonization that have become central to how we need to move forward. With that in mind, thank you so much for coming to my presentation. Feel free to reach out at my email or connect with me on LinkedIn if you want to chat further, talk about the research, anything like that. Yeah, and that is the end of my presentation, and I'm ready for questions.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was very interesting, and I appreciate you sharing your experiences with us. So I will say that we had several questions that came in during your presentation that you then subsequently answered in your presentation. So, we do have some other things we can talk about here. Regarding the model minority myth, we had a question about whether a lot of anti-Asian racism is seen as a sort of left-wing, right-wing issue, but the model minority myth can be prevalent, even in left-wing communities and even in, I think, the humanist communities. Do you have?
Right.
Can you expand on that? Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Again, you can't talk about anti-Asian racism without bringing in the model minority myth. It's such an important part of, and I probably could have allotted more time to it, although, I did have a pretty tight presentation.
Absolutely. We didn't give you much time.
And I wanted to focus. Right, but no worries. Let's see, how do I approach this? I think the issue is that a lot of people see anti-Asian racism, and I would say probably the biggest model minority groups in North America, you think of probably East Asians and Jewish people. Those are probably the big ones. And both of these share the commonality that when anti-Semitism or anti-Asian racism, when they emerge and when they manifest, people think of it, I think that's what you mean by a right-left issue, is that people see it as some sort of punching up. People see it as, oh, these people are doing better than us. Like it's okay to kind of stomp on them. It's okay to be punching up, right? Because they're doing better than us, which is frankly not the truth. Asian Americans and Jewish Americans are seen as doing better largely by the making of the white supremacist institution that made them look that way. It was intentional. That's why I used the term the strategic rebranding. I saw that during my research and I thought that was such an adequate description of what is happening. It's the strategic rebranding of Asian Americans and of Jewish Americans as an ethnicity, as a race, as a culture, as a group. Your ethnicity, your nationality, your racial background should not be political. That's what you are. You can't, and the fact that politics and white supremacist politics have been able to politicize that is deeply, deeply disturbing. But yeah, no, I think the narrative of punching up is deeply harmful. And the idea of just politicizing hate crimes and politicizing hate is, deeply problematic, as we can probably all agree on. But I just want to reiterate again, like the white supremacist, the model minority myth was intentional. It was intentionally placed there and perpetuated, and that narrative was accentuated by the white supremacy and by establishments to essentially put Asian Americans and Black and Brown Americans against each other, to put racial minorities against each other, to prevent solidarity. Because when we have solidarity, that's how we can truly do something about white supremacy and truly make progress. But when we're too busy infighting and fighting amongst ourselves and worrying about punching up or punching down, then we're not making real progress. And I think that's just something to keep in mind.
So this is something we've explored a little bit in articles in thehumanist.com, but the sort of acronym that gets used, AAPI, Asian American and Pacific Islander, is very broad. So can you talk a little bit about ways that maybe using that big a group or that kind of acronym covers up different groups that may or may be experiencing some things in common, but also some issues that are specific to one group or another?
Oh yeah, I think when we use any sort of overarching acronyms, we risk tokenizing, and we risk, it's easy to say, oh, we have POCs on our board of directors, and we have one light-skinned person of color that could be white passing or is racially ambiguous, etc. Right? That leads to a lot of discussions that can be had. And I think that's the same thing as why the acronym BIPOC was eventually created, to emphasize Black, Indigenous communities, is to take over the term POC, because I think for the same reasons that maybe people in the Asian community don't love the AAPI acronym. People, don't love the POC acronym, and that's kind of the issue. But the truth is, we do need terms to talk about issues. And AAPI is probably the biggest and most overarching, which partially is because race, is socially constructed, and it's hard to draw a line as to exactly here you're Asian, especially if you're looking at the Polynesian Islands, and the Philippines. If you look, in the southeast, you're like, okay, so where do we draw the line as to Pacific Islander or Asian? Because it's hard to draw that line. So I understand why they kind of just decided to group everybody together. But I know a lot of Asian Americans don't think that term means anything or has any rationale behind it. But to me personally, I would say I'm pretty neutral about the term. I think we need terms to talk about issues, and that's the point of them at the end of the day, is a verbiage and a tool for us to discuss issues. And as long as we're discussing them in a productive way that respects the distinction of Asian Americans, which the Pan-Asian movement, sort of the Pan-Asian activism in North America, didn't really come together until the 60s in the United States. For the longest time before that, they were individual communities, Japanese Americans, the Chinese Americans. They had their own things going on. They advocated for themselves. They built themselves up. They worked on their own terms, and not necessarily as a cohesive solidarity. So I think it's interesting to now force such large amount of groups into one solidarity. But at the end of the day, terms are for discussing issues, and it's more important that we discuss issues, in my opinion, that get caught up on whether or not, if a Pacific Islander is really Asian, or if Asians are East Asians really all have all that much in common with Pacific Islanders, or blah, blah,
right.
blah.
One last question is, Sam asks, points out that there's a group in New Jersey that is working on integrating more history of Asian Americans into public school curriculums. I know that you work with the Secular Student Alliance and have some interest in education. Are you aware of other moves like that, or?
I'm gonna be honest, I'm not. I'm actually not. I've never heard of that group. I think what they're doing is really awesome. I'd love to, know more about what they're doing. I think that's really cool. But I think largely, this was something I didn't really have the time to cover in my presentation. But America's view of race is black and white. Until quite recently, being Asian, being Hispanic weren't really discussed. They weren't even legal categories in the US consciousness. You literally couldn't check a box that said you were Asian or you were Hispanic. You were either black or you're white. And that still, I guess persists today, is that when we discuss history, when we discuss racism, it's always a black or white paradigm. And while it's crucially important, and I'm so proud of, the progress that our Black brothers and sisters have made in terms of getting their history more recognized and more talked about in recent years, that doesn't necessarily bring liberation to the rest of us. And I think that goes back to the issue of acronyms, right? When we say, oh, POCs are getting more representation, POCs are getting their history more discussed. Who exactly are these POCs, right? Are they Asians? Are they Black? Because they all have different histories, right? We all have different histories. Is it Indigenous people? Because they also have very distinct histories and issues that affect them. And I think it's great. I think it's amazing to see, Asian American histories being highlighted more. The Los Angeles massacre that I mentioned, also known as the Chinatown massacre, was the biggest lynching in US history. And we weren't taught that in textbooks. We weren't even really taught about anti-Asian racism unless, you really look into that and you explore that on your own terms. You aren't taught that in 8th grade history books. And when I first learned that, I was in college, and I was absolutely shocked by the fact that the largest lynching in US history was committed against Chinese Americans. I did not expect that at all. And that's because of a lack of education. And I think it would be great if we can integrate more education of history, not just blatantly saying POC history, but actually highlighting Indigenous perspectives, Asian perspectives, Black perspectives, brown perspectives. I think that would be an important and really amazing move to see in our education system overall.
I said that was going to be our last question, and then we got another one, and we do have a couple of minutes. So this one is about Christian nationalism. And can you touch on the ways that Christian nationalism undermines and influences current resistance and equity efforts as it relates to Asians and brown people?
Yeah, I think I touched on this a bit in my presentation, but I'm East Asian, so I'll talk from an East Asian lens. But as an East Asian, person of Chinese descent, it is very obvious to me that the Christian white American nationalists still link being Asian to being communist, to being atheist, which is, as they know, evil, very much, and as being foreign, that's xenophobia. No matter if you're Asian American, if you're third generation Asian American, they don't care. To them, you're foreign, you're a foreigner, you didn't come from here. They'll tell you to go back to where you came from, even though you came from New Jersey or Florida, or wherever you came from, right? And you see that even more with, well, the term brown covers a lot of people, but I guess in this way, maybe we're discussing, Middle Easterners or Arabs. So in that case, we see that probably even more prominently in recent years of Christian nationalists labeling pretty much anybody that is brown as being Muslim, as being terrorists, and that same kind of linkage in their mind goes the same way. If you're brown, you're Arab, you're Muslim, you're a terrorist. Same way, if you're East Asian, you're communist, you're atheist, you're evil, and you're here to undermine the white nationalist state, right? And that's how it is, because white Christian nationalists hold a very rigid view of America and what American nationalist, American patriot is and looks like. And is a person that is a white Christian nationalist, as we talked about. And these other people that don't fit in that view, they're all foreign, they're all evil, they're all here to undermine the American state. And I think that is, that is something that affects the overall BIPOC community. You see this being initially used against indigenous people probably the most. They were characterized savages, they were characterized as evil and awful and backwards because they weren't Christians and they weren't white. And in a lot of cases, converting to Christianity was their only way of survival. And you see that in forced residential schools all over the US and Canada. The whole goal was to civilize indigenous peoples by converting them to Christianity. And that was seen as a rite of passage to being a human, essentially. And that's a terrifying rhetoric that still persists, to this day. And that's something that I think we as humanists and secularists and activists have a huge role in addressing.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. This has been really fascinating. There are lots of people in the chat saying thank you, including, I just noticed, Kevin Bowling.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks for coming.
And saying that they got a lot out of your presentation. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.